Welcome to the first episode of Ecosystem Explorers. My name is Crissy, and I'm a biology major here at UCF.
My name is Jimmy Michaels, and I'm an environmental studies major here at UCF.
My name is Alyssa Case, and I'm a biology major.
My name is Elizabeth O'Shea, and I'm also an environmental studies major at UCF.
And today, this is our Florida Ecology podcast, where we talk about various Florida ecosystems and some of the conservation issues surrounding these areas. So today we're going to be talking about pine flatwoods, where Alyssa and Ellie are going to give us some background about the ecosystem.
Pine flatwoods are a very extensive ecosystem in Florida, which used to cover over 50% of the land area in the state. The makeup of pine flatwoods is going to vary depending on the soil moisture. The soil in pine flatwoods varies from mesic, which is a more moderate moisture level, to hydric, which is a more saturated with water and tends to flood. The mesic pine flatwoods have an open pine woodland area with little to no mid-story and dense ground cover. This means that there's a big area of open air in between the tall canopy trees and the shrubs on the ground, such as saw palmetto, wiregrass, gallberry, and dwarf live oak. As for hydric flatwoods, their understory is going to differ slightly. Hydric flatwoods have much greater biodiversity, and the ground cover tends to be less woody and more herbaceous.
A lot of pine flatwoods growth is going to depend on the soil composition. These ecosystems tend to grow on low, flat land with poorly drained soil. During summer, Florida gets lots of rain that runs into these lowlands and can't drain because of the high water table. The soil tends to be sandy, slightly acidic, nutrient poor, can be mesic to hydric, and has multiple layers throughout.
This ecosystem is dominated by a few main tree species, mainly the slash pine and the South Florida variation, which has a grass stage much like the longleaf pine and has smaller cones, the pond pine, which is found in hydric flatwoods, especially near water, and the longleaf pine.
Yeah, and speaking of longleaf pine, it's a very important species to the pine flatwoods ecosystem. Historically, they are very prevalent across the state. Their pre-colonial range stretched about 90 million acres across the state, and currently less than 5% of that remains today. So longleaf pine is still a very vital resource, especially to the variety of fauna that use them. And these systems really need to be maintained in order for the ecosystem to stay healthy. And one of those main methods that's used is fire. So fire management is super important because mismanagement leads to very dense understory overgrowth, which is detrimental to the ecosystem, as well as an accumulation of fuel for fires that could lead to devastating wildfires in the future.
To expand on fire management, we have a special guest today, John Guzica with UCF, and we're going to get into that interview right now. We're here with John Guzica from UCF Natural Resources, and we're going to talk about pine flatwood systems today. John, can you tell us about yourself and your position here at UCF?
Yeah, so my name is John Guzica. I'm the manager of the Urban Forestry and Natural Resources program here. So essentially that means I'm in charge of all the landscape trees. I've included in that is actually the planned and maintained landscape of the university, but also the entire forested system that we have attached to the urban campus. And it encompasses about 900 acres.
So what does a typical day look like for you as a natural resources manager here at UCF?
So we get started very early. Usually I'm in the office by 6:30. It's the best time to do work outside, if y'all didn't know. And I have a small team of biologists, interns, and OPS students that help me manage the forest on a daily basis. So we usually starts with meeting with them and disseminating tasks. These tasks involve vegetation monitoring, invasive and exotic species mapping and removal, trail maintenance, and of course, prescribed fire.
So what are some of the biggest effects of fire mismanagement on pine flatwood systems in your opinion?
So fire mismanagement, that can go one of two ways. It can either be the forest system has not been burned in a very long time, which I would consider mismanagement because there's negative repercussions of that. And then there's also systems that sometimes can be burned too much. We'll probably get into fire intervals a little further into the conversation. But probably the biggest threat to us are what we call backlog systems, and that's essentially forested systems that are naturally pyrophytic, that means well adapted to frequent fires, that are not exposed to this disturbance. A lot of the forested systems here in Florida, pine flatwoods being the main ecosystem encompassing most of the natural areas in Florida, has a burn interval between 1 and 3 years. There's a gradient depending on what kind of flatwoods it is, but if you do not conduct prescribed fires and keep that regular disturbance going, you have a competition threat beginning to occur in the pine flatwoods. There's a three-tiered vegetation relationship occurring in most pine flatwood systems. You have the herbaceous level vegetation, mid-story level vegetation, and your canopy vegetation. Well, in order for the herbaceous level vegetation to thrive, which is very important to a lot of the smaller creatures, and of course the biodiversity count of the flora in the area, if you don't burn it regularly, you get the mid-story level vegetation and the canopy vegetation growing up very high and very dense, and it outcompetes that herbaceous level vegetation. What you get in backlog systems are a transition of ecosystems. That's kind of how maybe a pine flatwoods would transition into what you would refer to as an upland scrub. Now, obviously, sometimes that transition could take a lifetime, but when we're talking about natural resources, talking about forestry, and talking about plants, you got to talk about it in the context that goes way past one single human life. So I would say mismanagement of Florida forests would be essentially not burning it.
And when you say backlog systems, I know on campus it took a while for them to actually become managed correctly. When did they start burning on campus?
Yeah, so good question. Our team started in 2005, and that was a response to a huge wildfire that broke out actually on the corner of Orion Boulevard and Gemini. It was a huge fire, and if you know campus, that's a pretty major intersection. And the fire was flame lengths of up to 15, 20 feet tall. I've seen pictures. It was actually in the newspaper back then. And that really kind of prompted a standardized plan for going about managing all of our forests, which we have a lot of compared to especially other universities. So the managers at the time put their heads together. They figured out exactly what they need to do. They got in touch with the local Florida Forestry Service, and they all basically created what we have now, which is the UCF prescribed fire team.
Another question that we had for you was, other than habitat fragmentation and some fire mismanagement issues, what other factors do you think endanger the pine flatwood systems?
Development, period. When we as naturalists, ecologists, biologists, plant and animal enthusiasts look out onto a pine flatwoods, we see all the plants, we see the biodiversity, we see the gorgeous aspects of nature. When an engineer or a developer look out onto the flatwoods, they think, wow, look how flat and perfect it is. We don't need to fill any of the areas. This is great. So flatwoods, unfortunately, also provide a wonderful building base for a lot of places, obviously. And Florida develops like crazy. A lot of people are coming here, a lot of movement. So you're starting to see it, especially around the Central Florida area. So I think the biggest threat to the pine flatwood system is development.
And then how do you think everyday people could help to protect pine flatwood systems?
Being a representative of the environment, joining local groups, being on county commission boards, and basically just helping lead the movement towards showing some of these developers that we do not want them to be developed. There's an enormous amount of ecosystem services that these forests provide us. And essentially just educating, speaking out and joining groups, signing petitions. And this is your everyday regular person that wants to get involved. Of course, people that specialize in environmental conservation can do a little bit more, but your average person, it's really what they can do. And with social media nowadays, we have a bigger online presence and influence than ever before. So that is certainly another tool.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, well, thank you, John, for taking your time out of your day to talk to us about some pine flatwood systems. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right. Thank you so much to John and all of the UCF organizations that work with the Arboretum and with the natural resources to help us rely on fire management for our ecosystems.
Yeah, that's so important to learn about because there's a wide variety of animals that call the pine flatwoods homes, such as the fox squirrel, bald eagle, and the northern bobwhite quail. Many of these animals are reliant on longleaf pine for habitat and for nesting, including the red-cockaded woodpecker.
So through our research, we found a study on red-cockaded woodpeckers that basically talked about the conservation methods that are trying to help bring the species back. The red-cockaded woodpecker has been federally endangered since October of 1970 due to habitat loss, and one clan of woodpeckers can live on 75 to 200 acres, and currently there's only around 4.7 million acres of longleaf pine left in the South, and they only make their nests in live longleaf pine. Historically, most longleaf pines were removed with timber extraction, leaving the red-cockaded woodpecker populations without homes.
Yeah, the red-cockaded woodpecker is a keystone species for many other species within the pine flatwoods, which is why protecting their habitat is vital. This study examined that burns can actually cause more harm to the cavities of the woodpeckers. Red-cockaded woodpeckers scratch bark to produce a resin which prevents predation. Resin is flammable, so the trees with high resin flow burned despite being raked to the base.
One of the methods was raking 3 meters from the base of every tree to try to prevent the fire from reaching the trunk. Similarly, they would plow fire lanes 60 meters from the edge of colony sites, hoping to stop the fire before it ever reached the homes. Another method they used was making artificial nests in healthy live longleaf pines in other locations, and so they would translocate the woodpeckers into these healthier longleaf pines in different areas, hoping that the colonies would populate and do better in these new places.
This method of protecting the colony's red-cockaded woodpeckers, in combination with translocation efforts, proper use of prescribed burns, and longleaf pine conservation, is leading to the increase of the population of the red-cockaded woodpecker.
Okay, so that brings up a really interesting point about conservation. It's definitely vital to the preservation of these pine flatwoods habitats and all of the plants and animals that are found there too. Currently, a lot of longleaf pine forests have been reduced to less than 3% of the area that they covered pre-settlement, pre-colonial area. So there are a lot of things that scientists and conservationists are doing to protect and manage these pine flatwood systems, and there's also options for everyday people to also be helping with the longleaf pine conservation.
Some other things that you can do to get active in your community and protect these pine flatwood systems. You can sign up for some prescribed burns if you can obtain a certification. I know here on campus at UCF they offer some discounted certification classes. Also, just everyday choices by purchasing Melaleuca mulch instead of cypress mulch. It's an invasive species, and they sell it at most home improvement stores around the area, and it's a great way to help preserve the pine flatwood systems.
Yeah, that also brings up another cool point. There are some local incentives for private landowners to restore longleaf pine as well. So if you do own any private land, they offer a Florida Longleaf Pine Landowner Incentive Program. This offers incentive payments for completion of timber stand improvement, also invasive species control and prescribed burning, planting longleaf pine, and establishing that native plant understory, as well as some underbrush treatments. So the private land's located within, I think it's about 58 counties in north of Lake Okeechobee. The historical range of longleaf pine in that area are eligible for the program. And I believe this started in June of 2020. So this is through the Florida Forest Service, and they offer quite a bit of incentives for protecting longleaf pine. So that is another option for landowners as well. All right, so thank you all for listening to our first episode on pine flatwoods. We hope you learned something new about Florida and are maybe inspired to protect this ecosystem that so many do call home, and it's very important to our Florida ecosystems. So stay tuned for next episode coming soon on the Ecosystem Explorers channel.